All right. So let's dive into it. The talk that I'm giving today is based on a paper that I wrote my first year in grad school, titled Female Autonomy and Societal Punishment, Barrenness of Self and Grave in Christina Rossetti's Goblin Market. So I will be essentially paraphrasing that paper and talking to you guys about it today. So we know that, or some of us may know that Christina Rossetti's Goblin Market was published around 1859, or written around 1859, and then later published in 1862. It is a poem that weaves this really complex narrative that does the job of both critiquing and reflecting upon societal expectations surrounding Victorian sexuality and womanhood, particularly in relation to the consequences of sexual transgression. So, this poem is richly layered and explores many themes like temptation, indulgence, and restoration. And it does this through the experiences of sisters Lizzie and Laura, who encounter goblin men and their enticing fruit market. And they know that they are socially not allowed to interact with them, but one of the sisters chooses to interact anyway. Laura's resolve breaks and she indulges in her desire for the exotic and delicious fruits, but eventually recovers from the illness that follows after a moment of true regret and repentance, as we'll talk about in just a little bit. Jeannie, on the other hand, is the only other named character in the poem, and she's referred to in this poem only three times, but she serves as a very significant cautionary tale about what may happen if one were to eat the fruit. And in the text, Jeannie ate the fruit and then withered and died. So her character serves as both a symbol of barrenness and loss and a representation of the tragic consequences of Victorian societal repression and moral punishment. We see in the poem Lizzie going to Jeannie's grave after she's died, and she plants flowers, specifically daisies, and they fail to grow, which kind of solidifies the permanence of Jeannie's fallen status, while Laura is a symbol of renewal through private remorse and repentance. And we'll talk about the floriographic meaning behind this interaction in just a bit. So, a multitude of scholars have published work on this poem, and it's still obviously highly studied to this day. And I wanted to add a bit to that scholarly conversation by bringing in themes of floriography and growth. So that's where this paper comes from. Um, though interpretations of this poem vary widely from scholar to scholar, most scholars generally agree that Rossetti's experiences at Highgate may have shaped her exploration of women's roles in society through Goblin Market, perhaps specifically the social consequences of deviating from prescribed moral behavior. William Rossetti's memory places Christina at Highgate, which was an institution for women, beginning in 1860, though a considerable number of sources claim she worked there beginning in 1859 and worked there through 1870. So, knowing that, if the sources who claim she began her work in 1859 are correct, that would be the year she wrote Goblin Market, and then the connection between Rossetti's personal experiences working with these women and the exploration of these roles becomes apparent when we examine specific characters and the symbolism within Goblin Market. She was in the Women to Women program to help rehabilitate former sex workers, and she was offered and also refused a superintendent position in favor of working directly with these women. So, in Victorian society, women were idealized as mothers and sexually pure beings, and their options for autonomy and financial freedom were basically non existent. Since marriage and childbirth were considered the epitome of Victorian female success, women were expected to marry, to have children, and to manage their households. In a paper titled Feminist Scholarship and the Social Construction of Women by Gail Green and Capelia Khan, they explore how the value of women had been reduced to their ability to marry, their ability to bear children and maintain their living space, while men were praised as intelligent, important, and socially dominant beings. So societies and cultures have widely accepted this binary as universal truth, and Victorian culture was really no exception. So this construct effectively moved sex and fertility from basic physical functions to a measurement of social value. Though the Victorian period is well known for its strict moral codes, during this time, a staggering 30 to 40,000 unwed mothers gave birth each year in England and Wales. Um, and respectability obviously was the firm foundation of Victorian society. And both sex and pregnancy were only socially accepted when it occurred in the proper sphere of marriage. So Green and Kahn, going back to that paper, they write, quote, women are the gifts which men exchange with each other. And we can see how this system of value is kind of reflected in Goblin Market with Jeannie's demise and Laura's downfall. So once they're no longer considered morally pure or socially appropriate, their worth diminishes and they are left to suffer the consequences of their perceived failings. So Jeannie's death underscores the consequences of failure to maintain Victorian standards of female virtue, and her inability to recover suggests that redemption is nearly impossible for women in a society that places crippling value on their purity and moral adherence. Jeannie's temptation, her indulgence in the goblin men's fruit, and then her subsequent decline and death illustrate how fallen women were kind of viewed in society. The goblin fruit, we can say, symbolizes hidden desires and temptation, and her indulgence in this fruit leads to her deterioration. That deterioration is the manifestation of her breaking social norms. And her death that follows this deterioration becomes the ultimate punishment for her transgressions. Her legacy is effectively reduced to a warning to other women and girls about the irreversible consequences of breaking the moral codes that are placed upon them. We can see a little bit of this play out in lines 147 through 162, which I'm going to pop into the chat now if you'd like to read them. Lizzie warns Laura. She says, "Do you not remember Jeannie? How she met them in the moonlight, took their gifts, both choice and many, ate their fruits and wore their flowers, plucked from bowers where summer ripens at all hours. But ever in the noonlight she pined and pined away, sought them by night and day, found them no more, but dwindled and grew gray, then fell with the first snow. While to this day no grass will grow where she lies low, I planted daisies there a year ago that never blow. You should not loiter so." So as Lizzie is giving Laura this warning, she says she that Jeannie indulged in this. She ate the fruits. She pined away. She sought them. She never found them again. She eventually died. And now the soil over her grave has been, I guess we could say, cursed. Nothing will grow there. So she says, "You should not loiter so," signifying there's some kind of urgency to this warning and reinforcing the swiftness with which Jeannie physically declines between meeting these goblin men in the summer and the first snowfall when she dies. But Laura does not heed this warning at all. Lizzie implies that Jeannie might be cursed in some way. Like I said, when she mentions that these daisies were planted a year ago and they've never grown, which is significant because daisies, especially wild daisies, are typically low maintenance plants that grow wildly and with abundance. So since Lizzie planted them and is surprised that they didn't grow, we can safely assume that the daisies should have grown because Jeannie is most likely buried in an area where these plants are well established. So the symbolism behind this lack of growth and what the flowers could mean is significant. The Victorian period saw a magnificent surge in the interest in flowers and their meanings, and thus the term floriography was coined. And the practice of using specific flowers as symbols became really popular. So, real quick in the chat, I'm going to pop a few links over for some floriography books that I have used in my studies. These books are published beginning in the 1860s. And then there's also one that's a little bit more recent than that, but I'm popping those links into the chat now. So if you want to look at them and look up a few meanings, They will be there for you to do so. I've got one more link that's coming. So you'll also notice that between these books, the meanings for most of these flowers are very consistent between these books, but there are a little bit of variation, but not very much. So, along with many other types of meanings, some flowers were often treated as a flexible symbol of female sexuality and encompassed meanings ranging from threatening promiscuity to spotless innocence to fertility and the nurturing of motherly feelings. So, after Jeannie's death, Lizzie visits her and plants these daisies on her grave in an act of remembrance, but we know the daisies will not grow despite Lizzie's effort. So these daisies could be symbolic of several things depending on the type of daisy, and the poem does not specify what type of daisy is being planted here, but I've collected a few different types of daisies that it could be. The most likely candidate would be the white field daisy, which is a perennial flower that's native and very prolific in the UK. And it's most likely the type of daisy that Rossetti was referring to. And white daisies are important here because as they were and still are associated with purity and innocence. For example, Victorian children would often pick white daisies and weave their very flexible stems into flower crowns or long garlands and would wear them as symbols of their virtuousness. And so popular were these white daisies that the company Morris and Company, which is based in London, created a daisy wallpaper in 1864, which became their very first retail product that they sold. And it was a bestseller for over 50 years. And you can actually still purchase this wallpaper today in their London-based showrooms. And I'm going to pop that link to that wallpaper into the chat so y'all can look. You can see the white daisies in the wallpaper with a few other flowers. But the name of that was at the time Daisy. So, excuse me. In Goblin Market, these white field daisies would carry significant symbolic weight, and their failure to grow on Jeannie's gravesite symbolizes her loss of purity and loss of fertility as a consequence of defying these ideals of feminine purity. The barrenness of the soil would reflect the irreversible damage done by consuming the goblin fruit and also symbolizes the permanence of her disgrace. Nothing will ever grow there. She will always be in disgrace. So even though the white daisies are most likely the type of flower Rossetti referred to in her poem, it's possible that she was referring to other less common types of daisies. If she had planted, for example, multicolored garden daisies, their meaning is I share your feelings. And this could symbolize Lizzie's sympathy for Jeannie and an acknowledgement of her suffering and death. She uses them as a symbol for mourning and solidarity. However, the daisy's failure to thrive could signify the limits of Lizzie's sympathy and suggest that she understands Jeannie's suffering but cannot fully approve of her actions. So she's aware that she must maintain this strict moral code or she may suffer the same fate as Jeannie. And I appreciate the juxtaposition of the flowers planted out of sympathy with the barren soil in which they fail to grow, because it reveals that the sympathy cannot exist without consequence as it applies to women who have fallen to temptation. So, one other likely option that the daisies could be is the Michaelmas daisies, which are called asters over here commonly. They're a symbol for farewell or the parting of ways, which makes sense in the context of Lizzie leaving them planted at Jeannie's grave. So, these tiny purple flowers could have been planted in an act of closure as a final farewell. But in the context of my research, I argue that they not only symbolize this farewell in the traditional sense of saying goodbye to a deceased friend, but rather Lizzie's planting of these daisies could be interpreted as a more ritualized acknowledgement of the consequences of defying such social norms. So she sees what's happening to Jeannie. She's horrified that Jeannie's plight resulted in her death and feels sadness for her fate. So she places the daisies at her grave as a symbol of her accepting the social norms in an effort to avoid the same fate, which is an act of farewell to her own desires. So daisies are not just a tribute to Jeannie, but also an acknowledgement of Lizzie's renunciation of temptation and her choice to adhere to social norms. So the act of planting them becomes both an act of mourning and a reaffirmation of her commitment to moral standards. So we can see now that the image of the barren grave and the daisies that will not grow serves as a metaphor for the control of female bodies by Victorian society. And it reinforces the idea that female sexuality should be controlled and contained. It conveys the idea that women who refuse to conform or control their sexual desires are estranged from society and unable to create new life. And the idea is that without moral purity and social conformity, there can be no life, no growth, and no regeneration. This social label effectively reduces Jeannie's value to nothing since Victorian women were valued for their fertility. So Lizzie covers this in the poems in lines 304 to 319, and I'm going to drop those in the chat now. She says, she thought of Jeannie in her grave who should have been a bride, but who for joys brides hope to have, fell sick and died in her gay prime, in earliest winter time, with the first glazing of rime, with the first snowfall and of crisp winter time. So the warning of Jeannie's death is a stark and very final consequence of failing to conform to Victorian ideals of purity and moral virtue, and echoes these Victorian fears of female sexual agency. So her decline, her death, and the barrenness of the soil at her grave are together symbolic of Victorian consequences of overindulgence and the moral ramifications of uncontrolled desire. And each reflects the Victorian fears of sexual autonomy and deviation from social and moral norms. Jeannie's inability to regain her health, become a mother, and have children and manage a household as expected is an illustration of the consequences of deviating from these norms, where, as we have established, the ability to marry and bear children was linked to social and moral value of women. So to lose social standing and not bear legitimate children was to become both literally and symbolically barren, which indicates Jeannie's death slowly comes once she no longer has the capacity to fill her only true responsibility as a proper Victorian woman. When it's quoted, she should have been a bride and experienced marriage and children. She instead pined and searched for more goblin fruit until she starved to death. So while Jeannie's death symbolizes the ultimate consequence of failing to adhere to Victorian ideals of innocence and purity, Laura's attempt to grow the kernel stone earlier in the poem illustrates a more hopeful yet ultimately fraught effort to reclaim her moral standing. So she hides this kernel stone from the goblin men as she leaves them, which could signify her desire to keep her newfound sexual freedom and could symbolize Laura's transgression. But I assert that the kernel stone provides the promise of fertility and rebirth and represents the possibility of redemption and growth. So she attempts to grow it, but she fails. And we see this happening in lines 281 through 287 of the poem, which I will drop into the chat now. So her growing of the kernel stone ultimately fails. It says that she sets it by a wall that faces the south and dewed it with her tears, hoped for a root, watched for a waxing shoot, but there came none. It never saw the sun. It never felt the trickling moisture run. So she's watering this kernel stone with her salty tears, which are not life bringing. And without proper moisture and sun, the kernel stone fails to grow. So, in a paper written by Elizabeth Russell called Christina Rossetti Contemporary Feminist, she asserts that the kernel stone is a dead seed. And because the saltwater tears it was watered with were not life giving, attempting to grow the stone and regain her futility was always futile. So, this interpretation sort of suggests that Laura's redemption is impossible to achieve on her own, as the dead seed reflects the permanence of her moral failure, and the tears that she washes over the planted kernel stone cannot bring life. And this indicates that her attempt to regain some type of fertility and social acceptance and purpose is ultimately meaningless. However, I argue that Laura's attempt to grow the kernel stone didn't have to succeed for her attempt to have meaning. The moment of planting and care signifies Laura's desire for reconciliation and redemption with the nurturing and pure woman society intends for her to be. So Laura's planting of the kernel stone evokes Victorian ideals of motherhood, of nurturing and growth, And her engagement with this kernel stone marks a very crucial moment in her desire and struggle for satisfaction. So her attempt to grow it suggests that she has not yet given up on regaining the social and moral status she once held as a Victorian woman. This attempt to grow it, to grow this kernel stone, is Laura's expression of a deeper struggle for fulfillment and moral redemption. It's a moment of self reflection for her that shows that she hasn't fully abandoned the hope for reconciliation with society. And then Russell also states in her paper that Jeannie's death is an effect of her lack of help in recovery, since she had no sister to help her. But I argue that Jeannie's inability to recover stems from both her continued and obsessive pursuit of the Goblin men and from the public nature of her transgression. While Laura's eventual recovery is linked to her confinement away from society during her time of illness and to the repentance that she feels upon learning her sister had visited the Goblin men and the juices that were taken from her sister's face. In other words, Jeannie had a very, very public downfall where people knew about her transgressions with the Goblin men. Laura and Lizzie knew about it, so we can assume that other people also knew about it. Whereas Laura and Lizzie are privately experiencing this in their home where the public cannot see. So Jeannie's unceasing pursuit of this fruit, this forbidden fruit, both physically and symbolically, displays a lack of restraint and a lack of remorse, and it ensures she will never recover. And she has such a high level of transparency with her transgression that members of the community know about it, unlike Laura, who remained out of view and was never seen during her illness by anyone other than her sister. So there is no opportunity for Jeannie to hide her transgression or to attempt to re-enter society without the fear of judgment or backlash, while Laura's concealment of her actions and her eventual remorse allow her to escape any negative social consequence that Jeannie suffered, because Laura's transgressions were not in the public view and she can preserve her social position once she recovers. So, Jeannie's indulgence in the Goblin men's forbidden and tempting fruits is a literal and figurative act of defiance of Victorian expectations of women, and her public searching for the Goblin men in their market without shame or concealment eventually leads to her pining away and dying. Her inability to stop yearning for the Goblin men's forbidden fruit, coupled with her lack of remorse for deviating from these social and moral expectations, represents an irreversible descent into decay, which reinforces the poem's moral warning against unchecked desire. So Jeannie never felt regret or remorse and never stopped searching for the Goblin men and their fruit. Line 155 says she sought them night and day. Unlike Laura, who was afraid for her sister's fate when she learned that Lizzie had gone and found the Goblin men in hopes of purchasing more fruit for her sister, only to return battered and with the Goblin men's fruit juices smeared on her face. So Laura thought Lizzie would suffer as she had been suffering and was tormented in thinking that she had doomed her innocent sister, who was only seeking the Goblin men out to try and save her. This is covered in lines 475 through 492 of the poem, which I'm going to pop in the chat now. It says that they share this intimate moment where she kissed and kissed and kissed her and tried to take the juices from her skin. They share this intimate and emotional moment as Laura is also experiencing anguish in causing her sister to seek out these Goblin men. She experiences fear surrounding her actions for the first time, and a fear for their future. And it appears that she feels helpless and that she was unable to stop Lizzie from seeking them out to begin with. So, this is actually a very significant moment of redemption for her. She feels true remorse and she recognizes the depth of her actions and the effect they have on her beloved sister, and she's really realizing all of this for the first time. So this is quite the pivotal moment in the text. Her anguish and the fear she feels for Lizzie, coupled with her desire to heal herself and her regret in meeting the Goblin men, allow for this transformative moment that Jeannie never got. It doesn't matter that Lizzie allows Laura to drink the juices off her face. The transformation began when Laura first felt this remorse and first saw her sister. So, unlike Jeannie, Laura's redemption is totally possible because of her willingness to feel remorse and acknowledge the effects of her transgression, which reach beyond herself and her reintroduction into society and her ability to later have a husband with children is possible because her transgression remained a private matter. So I assert that we can understand how Jeannie's barren grave serves as both this reflection point for personal tragedy and a commentary on the social limitations placed on women as far as moral judgment, shame, isolation, and things like that go. So Laura privately suffered out of societal view and repented in private, which allowed society to ignore her transgressions, what she repented. Society never saw her interact with the goblin men or suffered because of it, unlike Jeannie, who was very public in her search for satisfaction and ultimately died. So the barrenness of her grave highlights the suffocating consequences the Victorian era placed on women who strayed from societal expectations, and it mirrors these social constructs that sought to suppress female expression and autonomy. Thus, the connection between Jeannie's death and the barren grave becomes a symbol for the ways in which society punishes women for their choices. The barrenness of her grave serves as a symbol for this social erasure, where women who publicly transgress without remorse are silenced and their potential for honor and future family are shattered, thus rendering Jeannie and her grave barren. And it becomes a critique of how sexuality was used as a form of social control. So the suddenly moralistic ending of the poem restores Laura to the ideal Victorian mother, unlike Jeannie's fate. Laura succumbs to the temptation of the goblin men's fruits. She ultimately experiences physical decline and recovery. But Jeannie's fate is far more tragic, as once she eats these goblin fruits, she is driven to search for the goblin men as she grows gray and dies as winter begins. So Jeannie and the barrenness of her grave provide a very haunting counterpoint to Laura's eventual recovery and fruitful life. So that is the paper at the end. Thank you for listening.